He sent for a sturdy widow to help survive the brutal Montana winter. But when the steam cleared at the Blackwood Creek station, the woman holding his marriage contract wasn't a widow. She was a runaway in ruined silk, carrying a loaded derringer and a secret that could kill them both. The year was 1884, and the Bitterroot Mountains did not forgive a man who faced them alone. Stephen Boone knew this better than anyone. He was a man carved from the very granite of the peaks he inhabited. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and eyes the color of a bruised winter sky. For 5 years, ever since the fever took his younger brother, Stefan had trapped and hunted the high ridges in total isolation. But as the autumn winds began to howl through the pines, carrying the bitter promise of a deep freeze, pragmatism won over pride. He needed a partner, not a lover, not a delicate flower to court, but a hardened partner to salt the meat, tend the fires, and watch his back when the timber wolves grew bold. He had paid $50 hard-earned in gold dust to Mrs. Agatha Moretti's matrimonial agency out of Denver. The letters that traveled up the stagecoach line promised a woman named Martha Higgins. She was 34, widowed by a mining accident, stout, plain-spoken, and claimed she could skin a buck faster than most men. She was exactly what Stefan needed, a simple bride for a brutal life. It was a grueling 2-day ride down the mountain to the booming railroad town of Blackwood Creek. The town was a festering wound of civilization cut into the pristine wilderness, smelling of coal smoke, stale whiskey, and unwashed men. Stefan stood on the wooden planks of the depot, his worn leather duster snapping in the chilled wind, his jaw set in a hard line. Beside him, Horace Fletch, the station master, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the tracks. "Train's running hot today, Stefan," Horace wheezed. "You sure about this? Mail-order brides. It's a gamble. A man buys a pig in a poke. He shouldn't be surprised when it squeals." "I didn't buy a pig, Horace. I bought a survivor," Stefan grunted, his eyes fixed on the horizon where a plume of black smoke stained the gray sky. The Union Pacific locomotive roared into the station, a massive iron beast hissing steam and screeching against the rails. The noise was deafening, shaking the very boards beneath Stefan's boots. As the train ground to a halt, the doors of the passenger cars swung open, spilling out a chaotic mix of prospectors, gamblers, and weary travelers. Stefan stepped forward, his eyes scanning the crowd for a stout woman in sensible calico. The platform began to empty, and the knot of anxiety in his chest tightened. Had she taken his money and run? Then, she stepped down from the second-class car. Stefan stopped dead in his tracks. The woman standing amidst the swirling steam looked like she had fallen out of a high-society parlor and been dragged through a coal chute. She was petite, fragile-looking, and shivering violently. She wore a dress of emerald green silk that was hopelessly impractical for the frontier, its hem stained black with soot and mud. A wide-brimmed hat, adorned with a single battered ostrich feather, sat askew on her head, partially hiding a face that was undeniably, disastrously beautiful. Her cheekbones were sharp, her skin pale, and her eyes wide, terrified, and an arresting shade of amber darted around the rough town like a trapped doe. She clutched a worn leather valise to her chest as if it were a shield. She was perhaps 22, and she was clearly not Martha Higgins. Stefan watched as she approached Horace Fletch. Her voice when she spoke trembled, but it carried the refined, polished cadence of the East Coast. "Excuse me, sir. I am looking for a Mr. Stefan Boone." Horace blinked, his jaw dropping slightly, before pointing a grimy finger at Stefan. "That mountain of a man right there, miss." The woman turned, and the breath seemed to leave her lungs as she looked up at Stefan. Stefan towered over her, his grim expression making him look more like an outlaw than a prospective husband. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "You're not Martha Higgins," Stefan stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that offered no pleasantries. The woman swallowed hard, her amber eyes meeting his. She reached into her valise with trembling fingers and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper. It was the contract from Agatha Moretti's agency. It bore Stefan's signature at the bottom. "My name is Clora," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Clora Smith. Martha. Martha fell ill in Cheyenne. She couldn't make the journey. She gave me the papers." She told me you were a good man, an honest man. Stefan stared at the paper, then back at her. The lie was so thin he could see the Rocky Mountains through it. No agency allowed a ticket transfer without a notary, and Martha Higgins wouldn't have handed over a $50 contract to a girl wearing ruined silk. "Where's the money I sent her for the final leg of the trip?" Stefan demanded. Clara flinched. I needed it. For the conductor. I had to pay extra for my trunk." Stefan looked past her. A porter was unceremoniously dumping a heavy, brass-bound leather trunk onto the platform. It was the kind of trunk royalty traveled with, not destitute widows. "Turn around, Miss Smith," Stefan said coldly. "The eastbound train leaves at dawn. Horace will let you sleep in the ticket office." I ordered a partner, not a parlor ornament. He turned on his heel, intent on walking away, on writing off the $50 as a bitter lesson. But as he took his first step, Clara lunged forward, her small hand grabbing the thick leather of his sleeve. Her grip was surprisingly desperate. "Please," she begged, abandoning the polite facade. The sheer terror in her eyes was raw and genuine. "If you leave me here, I am dead. You paid for a wife. I will work. I will do whatever you ask. Just take me out of this town. Take me up the mountain. Now." Stefan looked at her hand on his sleeve, then at her face. He saw the way she nervously glanced over her shoulder at the train, the way her eyes darted toward the shadows of the alleyways. She wasn't just out of place, she was hunted. A smart man would have walked away. The frontier was filled with other people's trouble, and taking it on usually ended with a bullet in the back. But Stefan Boone, despite his rugged exterior, possessed a fatal flaw, a buried, stubborn sense of duty. "Can you ride a horse?" he asked gruffly. "I can learn," Clara lied. Stefan cursed softly under his breath. "Get your trunk. We leave in 10 minutes. And Miss Smith, if you slow me down, I'll leave you for the cougars." The journey up to the Bitterroot cabin was a brutal, bone-jarring ordeal that stripped away the last remnants of Clara Smith's Eastern refinement. Stefan did not slow his pace. He rode his massive draft-cross Goliath and put Clara on a cantankerous roan mare that tested every ounce of her limited riding ability. The trail was practically non-existent, a winding, treacherous path of loose shale, fallen timber, and steep inclines that seemed to touch the clouds. For 2 days, the silence between them was heavier than the freezing mountain air. Clara suffered in agony. The thin silk of her dress offered no protection against the biting wind. The friction of the saddle rubbed her legs raw, and the sheer altitude left her gasping for breath. Yet, she never complained. Every time Stefan glanced back, expecting her to be weeping or begging to stop, he found her gritting her teeth, her knuckles white as she gripped the reins, her amber eyes burning with a stubborn, desperate fire. It was the only thing about her that he respected. When they finally broke through the tree line and arrived at Stefan's cabin on the evening of the second day, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening a heavy snowfall. The cabin was a primitive squat structure made of thick, unpeeled logs, mud chinking, and a sod roof. It was functional, heavily fortified against the elements and predators, but it possessed exactly 0 comforts. Stefan pushed open the heavy oak door. The interior smelled fiercely of wood smoke, cured venison, and old leather. There was one room, dominated by a large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a single bed layered with thick bear pelts. "Home," Stefan said dryly, tossing his saddlebags onto the table. "I'll stable the horses. Get a fire going. The kindling is in the box by the hearth. Matches are on the mantel." He didn't wait for a response, stepping back out into the freezing dusk. When he returned 20 minutes later, the cabin was still pitch black and freezing. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the room. Clara was kneeling by the hearth, her hands covered in soot, quietly sobbing in frustration. She had managed to pile the wood haphazardly, but couldn't get a spark to take. Stefan let out a long, slow breath. He walked over, gently nudged her aside, and knelt. With 3 precise movements, he arranged the kindling, struck a match, and coaxed a steady, warm blaze to life. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. She looked utterly defeated, wiping a smudge of soot across her cheek, only making it worse. "I have never." "The servants, always." Servants, Stefan repeated, the word tasting sour in his mouth. He stood up and looked down at her. Miss Smith, I don't know what kind of fantasy you're living in, but there are no servants here. There is only work, or there is starvation. Tomorrow, you learn to chop wood. Tonight, you sleep. He pointed to the bed. Take it. I'll sleep on the floor. The next few days were a masterclass in disaster. Clara burned the beans, nearly chopped off her own toe with the hatchet, and ruined a good shirt trying to wash it in the freezing creek. But the tension in the cabin wasn't just born of her incompetence. It was the suffocating weight of her secrets. Stefan watched her constantly. She jumped at every snapping branch outside, and she slept with her valise clutched against her chest. The breaking point came on the fourth night. A massive blizzard had blown in, trapping them inside the cabin as the wind shrieked like a dying animal around the eaves. Clara had exhausted herself trying to scrub the floors, and had fallen into a deep, heavy sleep on the bed. Stefan was sitting by the fire, mending a leather harness, when he noticed Clara's brass-bound trunk. She had locked it the moment they arrived and kept the key on a ribbon around her neck. But earlier that day, while she was hauling water, she had hastily shoved a blanket inside and failed to clasp it properly. The lid sat a half-inch ajar. Stefan was not a snooper by nature, but he was a survivor. Ignorance in the mountains got you killed. If the woman sleeping in his bed brought danger to his doorstep, he needed to know the shape of it. He set down his harness, walked over to the trunk, and lifted the lid. The top layer was what he expected. Fine dresses, silk undergarments, velvet ribbons, frivolous things that had no place in the Bitterroots. But as he pushed the fabric aside, his hand brushed against something hard at the bottom, a false floor. Stefan pulled his hunting knife from his belt and wedged the blade into the seam of the wood, prying it upward. The thin panel popped loose. Stefan stared into the hidden compartment, his blood running cold. Lining the bottom of the trunk were neatly stacked bundles of federal banknotes. Stefan had never seen so much money in his life. It had to be upwards of $20,000. Each stack was wrapped in paper bands, stamped with black ink. First National Bank of Cheyenne. Tucked beside the money was a silver-plated Derringer pistol, a small velvet box containing a diamond necklace, and a folded newspaper clipping. Stefan picked up the paper, holding it toward the firelight. It was a week-old copy of the Denver Post. The headline screamed in bold type, "Railroad Baron Anthony Smith murdered in his Cheyenne estate. Daughter Clara missing. Pinkerton suspect foul play and theft of company payroll." Beneath the headline was a sketch of Clara, looking regal and haughty, a stark contrast to the soot-stained woman currently snoring softly in his bed. The article detailed that the famed Pinkerton detective, Josiah Flint, a man known across the West for his ruthlessness and perfect track record, had been hired to track the heiress down. Flint was authorized to use lethal force. Stefan slowly folded the newspaper. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. She hadn't bought the ticket from Martha Higgins. She had likely stolen it, or bribed the woman to disappear, using the matrimonial agency as the perfect cover to vanish into the wilderness. He hadn't brought home a clumsy bride. He had brought home a wanted murderess and a fortune in stolen payroll. "You're going to hand me over to him, aren't you?" Stefan whipped around. Clara was sitting up in bed. The firelight caught the terror in her eyes, but her hand was steady. She was pointing the silver Derringer, which she must have slipped out of the trunk earlier, directly at his chest. "Put the gun down, Clara," Stefan said, his voice dangerously calm. He didn't flinch. "You read the paper," she said, her voice shaking, the gun trembling slightly. "You know who they sent. Josiah Flint. He is a monster. Stefan, he isn't a lawman. He's an assassin on Anthony Smith's payroll." "Anthony Smith is dead," Stefan said. "It says right here you killed him." "He was my uncle," Clara screamed, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "Not my father, my uncle. He stole my father's shares in the railroad when he died. He kept me locked in that house like a prisoner. He was planning to marry me off to one of his investors to secure a land deal. When I found out he was the one who tampered with my father's carriage. When I found the proof, he tried to kill me." She lowered the gun a fraction, her chest heaving. "The money is mine. It was my father's inheritance. I took it, and I ran. My uncle's men chased me into the rail yard. I didn't shoot him, Stefan. I swear to God. Josiah Flint killed my uncle when the old man tried to double-cross the Pinkertons on their fee. Flint framed me so he could hunt me down and take the money for himself. Stefan stared at her. The wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the heavy timber. He looked from the frightened girl to the mountain of cash in the trunk. It was a wild story. A desperate, impossible story. Before Stefan could decide whether to believe her or disarm her, a sound cut through the roar of the blizzard. It was faint, but unmistakable to a mountain man. The sharp, high-pitched crack of a Winchester rifle. It echoed from the ridge, just a half-mile below the cabin. Someone was out there, in the whiteout, and they were coming up the trail. In a single fluid motion, Stefan kicked the heavy iron kettle off its hook, sending gallons of boiling water hissing over the hearth. The fire died instantly in a cloud of blinding, choking steam. Total darkness plunged the cabin into an icy void, save for the faint, pale moonlight filtering through the frosted window panes. "Stefan?" Clara whispered, panic threading her voice. The silver derringer shook in her grip. "Quiet," Stefan commanded, his voice barely a rasp over the howling wind. He moved across the pitch-black room by memory alone, grabbing Clara by the shoulder and dragging her toward the center of the floor. He dropped to his knees, his calloused fingers finding the iron ring of the root cellar trapdoor. He yanked it upward. The smell of damp earth and stored potatoes wafted up. "Get in," he ordered, physically pushing her toward the dark hole. "No, I can fight." "That gun of yours holds 2 bullets and is useless past 10 feet, Stefan hissed, forcing her down the wooden rungs. "If Josiah Flint is out there, he hasn't come alone. Stay quiet. If I fall, you wait until they enter the cabin. You shoot the first man you see, and you run into the timber. Understood?" Before she could answer, he slammed the heavy trapdoor shut, plunging her into absolute blackness. Stefan threw a braided rug over the boards, concealing the seams. He then retrieved his Winchester, 1873, from the wall mounts, pumping a heavy 44-40 cartridge into the chamber. He strapped his Colt single-action Army revolver to his thigh. The familiar weight, a cold comfort against the surging adrenaline. He didn't have to wait long. The heavy crunch of boots on the crusted snow sounded from the front porch. Then, a voice cut through the shrieking wind, smooth, cultured, and dripping with lethal confidence. "Stefan Boone, I know you can hear me in there." The voice belonged to Josiah Flint. It was a voice that didn't belong in the untamed wilderness. It was the sound of a polished mahogany boardroom where men's lives were traded for copper pennies. "My name is Josiah Flint. I am a duly appointed agent of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. You are harboring a fugitive named Clara Smith. She is wanted for the murder of Anthony Smith and the theft of a company payroll." Stefan pressed his back against the thick log wall beside the heavy oak door. He said nothing. "I am a reasonable man, Boone," Flint called out, his voice slightly muffled by the timber. "The bounty on her head is $5,000. The stolen money belongs to the railroad. Open this door, hand over the girl in the trunk, and I will personally count out $2,000 into your hand. You can buy yourself a dozen mail-order brides with that. Refuse, and my men will burn this cabin to the ground with you inside it." Stefan knew the reputation of men like Flint. The offer was a lie. The moment Stefan opened the door, he would catch a bullet in the gut. Flint couldn't leave witnesses to a stolen payroll he intended to pocket. Stefan slid the barrel of his Winchester through a narrow, chinked gun port beside the window. He caught a glimpse of a shadow moving near the woodpile. "I don't much care for trespassers, Flint." Stefan roared back, his deep voice carrying over the gale. "And I care even less for men who hide behind badges to do an assassin's work. You have 3 seconds to get off my ridge." "Burn it!" Flint barked. The darkness outside erupted in a terrifying staccato of muzzle flashes. Deafening gunfire ripped into the cabin. Heavy lead slugs tore through the window panes, showering the floor with jagged glass, and thudded deeply into the thick oak door. Stefan dropped to a crouch, the air inside the cabin instantly filling with the acrid, sulfurous stench of black powder. Stefan returned fire. He aimed at the muzzle flashes, the Winchester bucking violently against his shoulder. He heard a sharp cry of pain from the woodpile, followed by the heavy thud of a body dropping into the snow. One down. "Keep him pinned!" Flint yelled from the safety of the tree line. Bullets chewed through the mud, chinking, raining dry dirt onto Stefan's shoulders. But Stefan had built this cabin to withstand a siege by Blackfoot raiding parties and grizzly bears. The logs were thick enough to stop most rifle rounds. However, Josiah Flint was not a fool. While his hired guns laid down, suppressing fire at the front, a scraping sound directly above Stefan made the mountain man's blood run cold. The roof. The sod roof was structurally sound, but the wide stone chimney was vulnerable. Before Stefan could pivot, a massive figure dropped down the chimney chute, landing in the warm ashes of the hearth with a heavy thud. It was a hired tracker, his face painted in soot, wielding a massive Bowie knife. Stefan swung the Winchester, but the tracker was impossibly fast. He lunged, driving his shoulder into Stefan's chest, sending them both crashing into the heavy oak table. The rifle clattered out of reach. The tracker pinned Stefan down, raising the gleaming blade high above his head, aiming for Stefan's throat. Stefan grabbed the man's wrist with both hands, his muscles screaming against the sheer weight and force of the attacker. The blade hovered inches from his windpipe, inching closer as the tracker snarled, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and chewing tobacco. Stefan's strength was fading. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed inside the small cabin. The tracker's eyes went wide. His grip went slack, and he slumped sideways, collapsing onto the floorboards with a heavy groan. Stefan gasped for air, shoving the dead weight off him. He looked up, standing over the trapdoor, illuminated by the pale moonlight spilling through the shattered window, was Clora. The rug was thrown aside. Both of her hands were wrapped around the small silver derringer, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its barrel. She was trembling violently, her eyes fixed on the man she had just shot. Stefan didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, drew his Colt revolver, and fired 2 blind shots out the window to keep Flint's men back. He rushed to Clora, grabbing her shoulders. "You did good," he said roughly, his voice firm but surprisingly gentle. "You did exactly what you had to do. Now, reload that gun." Outside, the gunfire abruptly ceased. The wind howled through the broken glass. "Cobb!" Flint's voice called out from the dark. "Cobb, report!" Silence. "Boone!" Flint yelled, the polished veneer cracking to reveal raw fury. "This isn't over. I have the high ground and the trail blocked. You can't stay in there forever. You'll freeze, or you'll starve. When the storm breaks, you're dead men." Stefan peered through the gun port. The shadows were retreating into the thick timber. Flint was pulling back to set up a perimeter. The siege was over, but the trap was set. The dawn arrived, not with the gentle glow of a sunrise, but with a harsh, blinding glare reflecting off a freshly buried world. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a silence so profound it made the ears ring. The Bitterroot Mountains were entombed in 3 feet of pristine, deadly snow. Inside the freezing cabin, the tension was a physical weight. Stefan sat shirtless on a wooden stool near the hearth. He had managed to rebuild the fire, the flames crackling and spitting as they consumed dry pine. Clora stood behind him, her hands stained with dried blood, his blood. During the struggle with the tracker, the Bowie knife had sliced a deep, jagged gash across Stefan's left shoulder blade. It wasn't fatal, but it was bleeding heavily. Clora had torn the bottom tier of her ruined emerald silk dress into long, shimmering strips. She was currently soaking a rag in boiling water, wringing it out, and gently pressing it against the raw wound. Stefan hissed through his teeth, his massive back muscles involuntarily clenching. "I'm sorry," Clora murmured softly. "I know it burns. I have to clean the dirt out or it will fester." "Do what you have to do," Stefan grunted, staring into the flames. For several minutes, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Clora's steady, rhythmic breathing. As she wrapped the vibrant green silk tightly around his broad chest to bind the wound, her hands lingered for a fraction of a second against his skin. It was an unconscious gesture, but the warmth of her touch sent a shockwave through Stefan that had nothing to do with the freezing air. He turned his head slightly, looking over his uninjured shoulder at her. Her face was smudged with soot and exhaustion. The haughty, terrified heiress from the train station was gone. In her place was a woman who had spent a night in a dark hole, shot a man to save a stranger's life, and was now binding wounds with the remnants of her past. "I underestimated you, Clora," Stefan said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. He didn't use Miss Smith. Clara paused, her amber eyes meeting his bruised gray ones. She tied off the silk bandage with a deft knot. I underestimated myself, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. She walked around him and sat on the edge of the bed, hugging her arms for warmth. When I saw that man with the knife over you, I didn't think. I just knew I couldn't let you die because of my mess. It's our mess now, Stefan said, standing up and reaching for a heavy flannel shirt. He winced as he pulled it over his injured shoulder. Flint is right. He's got men watching the main trail down the mountain. They'll wait for us to try and make a run for Blackwood Creek, and they'll pick us off from the ridge. Clara looked at the brass-bound trunk in the corner. We could give him the money. I don't care about it anymore, Stefan. I just want to live. He wouldn't leave us alive, Stefan corrected her grimly. A Pinkerton agent stealing a payroll? That's the kind of secret a man kills for to keep buried. No, handing over the money is a death sentence. Then we are trapped. Clara's voice was hollow. No. Stefan walked over to a heavy wooden chest beneath the window and began pulling out cold weather gear, thick wool coats, heavy snowshoes, and coils of climbing rope. Josiah Flint is a city man. He knows brick alleys and train yards. He doesn't know the Bitterroots. He thinks there's only one way off this mountain. Clara stood up, her brow furrowed. Is there another way? Stefan turned to her, a hard, reckless light in his eyes. There is. The natives call it the spirit path. Trappers call it the devil's drop. It's a sheer, treacherous cut through the northern ridge. It bypasses the main trail entirely and dumps out in a valley 10 miles east of Blackwood Creek. Flint won't have it guarded because no sane man attempts it in the winter. Are we sane men, Stefan? She asked, a faint, wry smile touching her lips despite the terror of the situation. I bought a bride through the mail, and you brought $20,000 in stolen cash to a mountain cabin, Stefan replied dryly. I think we left sanity at the train depot. He tossed her a heavy fur-lined coat that drowned her small frame. Bundle up, empty your valise and pack as much of that cash as you can carry. We leave the heavy trunk behind. We travel light and we travel fast. Clara didn't argue. She moved with a newfound purpose, snapping the false bottom of her trunk open and hastily stuffing the thick bands of banknotes into her leather bag. As Stefan strapped on his gun belt and grabbed his Winchester, he paused, watching her. The way the oversized coat swallowed her, the fierce determination in her jaw. He realized then that the $50 he had sent to Agatha Moretti's matrimonial agency had been the best investment of his life. He hadn't gotten a sturdy widow to churn butter. He had gotten a warrior in green silk. Clara, Stefan said softly. She stopped, looking up at him, clutching the bag of money to her chest. The devil's drop is dangerous. One slip, and it's a 1,000-foot fall. You step exactly where I step. You don't look down, and you don't let go of my hand. Clara walked up to him. She was dwarfed by his sheer size, but she didn't shrink back. She reached out, placing her small, cold hand over the thick, calloused knuckles of his hand holding the rifle. I won't let go, Stefan, she said, her amber eyes locking onto his with absolute, unwavering trust. Lead the way. Stefan kicked open the heavy oak door. The blinding white expanse of the mountain awaited them. Together, the mountain man and the runaway heiress stepped out into the freezing unknown, leaving the smoking ruins of their old lives behind them. The spirit path was less a trail and more a cruel joke carved by glaciers into the side of the Bitterroot Range. It was a 2-foot-wide ledge of slick granite, blanketed in fresh, treacherous snow, bordered on the left by a sheer, vertical wall of rock, and on the right by a staggering 1,000-foot drop into a jagged ravine. Stefan and Clara moved at an agonizing crawl. They were roped together at the waist, a desperate tether against the unforgiving gravity of the mountain. The wind here was a physical entity, screaming in their ears, trying to pry them off the ledge. Stefan led the way, using the butt of his Winchester to test the snow before committing his weight. Every muscle in his broad back strained, the wound beneath his heavy coat burning with a dull, throbbing fire. Behind him, Clara was a revelation. She did not weep. She did not complain. She kept her amber eyes locked dead onto the center of Stefan's back, stepping precisely into the deep footprints his boots left behind. She clutched the leather valise of stolen banknotes tightly, but it was clear that survival, not wealth, was the only currency that mattered up here. They had been inching along the Devil's Drop for 2 hours when the ledge began to widen, signaling the final approach to the eastern descent. Stefan let out a ragged breath, the condensation freezing instantly on his beard. "We're almost clear," he called back over his shoulder, his voice hoarse. "The trail widens out past that jagged spire." Clara nodded, her lips blue, her face pale but resolute. But as Stefan rounded the icy spire, he froze. The blood drained from his face. Standing 30 yards away, blocking the only path down into the valley, was a lone figure leaning heavily against a boulder. He wore a heavy buffalo coat, and his face was frostbitten and pale, but the manic gleam in his eyes was unmistakable. He held a repeating rifle, leveled directly at Stefan's chest. Josiah Flint had not waited out the storm. "You underestimate the resources of the Pinkerton Agency. Boone," Flint spat, his cultured voice cracked by the brutal cold. "I had a Shoshone guide waiting at the depot. Paid him $50 to show me the back door to your little fortress. He didn't survive the climb, unfortunately. But I did." Flint racked the lever of his rifle. The metallic clack was deafening against the snowy silence. "I've got the high ground, a steady hand, and absolute authority," Flint sneered. "Toss the rifle over the edge, Boone, then send the girl forward with the bag. I leave with the money. You two can freeze on this ledge for all I care." Stefan tightened his grip on the Winchester. If he fired, the recoil on this slick ice would likely send him over the edge, dragging Clara with him. If he didn't, Flint would simply shoot him the moment he dropped his weapon and take the girl anyway. It was a dead end. "Do it, Stefan," Clara whispered from behind him. Stefan felt the tension on the rope slacken. He turned his head slightly. Clara had unclipped the heavy leather valise from her shoulder. She stepped out from behind Stefan's massive frame, moving to the very lip of the precipice. Her boots were half suspended over the 1,000-foot drop. "Clara, no!" Stefan barked. "Mr. Flint!" Clara yelled, her voice ringing clear and steady over the howling wind. "You came for my uncle's money! You killed him for it, and you hunted us for it!" Flint's eyes darted to the bag she held over the abyss. Panic flashed across his frostbitten features. "Careful, you foolish girl. The wind will take you both. I am tired of running, and I am tired of men deciding my fate," Clara declared, her amber eyes blazing with a fierce, wild light that outshone the harsh winter sun. "You want the Smith fortune so badly? Have it." With a sudden, violent thrust of her arms, Clara hurled the leather valise outward. Time seemed to slow down. The bag arced over the yawning chasm. The faulty brass clasp, weakened by the cold and the rough journey, suddenly gave way. The valise popped open in mid-air. Thousands of green federal banknotes erupted into the sky like a flock of startled birds. $20,000 caught the brutal mountain updraft, swirling and scattering into the endless, bottomless void of the ravine. "No!" Flint screamed. The polished assassin lost his mind. Driven by pure, unadulterated greed, and the sight of his fortune blowing away, he dropped his rifle and lunged forward, scrambling wildly toward the edge to catch the fluttering bills. He didn't check his footing. His city-made boots hit a patch of black ice concealed beneath the snow. Flint slipped. His arms flailed wildly, his fingers grasping at empty air, and a single $50 bill. A high-pitched, terrified shriek tore from his throat as he pitched forward, vanishing over the edge of the Devil's Drop. The scream faded into the roaring wind, swallowed by the mountain. Stefan stood paralyzed for a second before he violently yanked the rope, pulling Clara back from the edge and into his chest. They collapsed together into the snow, Stefan wrapping his arms around her trembling frame, burying his face in the fur of her oversized coat. "It's gone," Clara sobbed, though whether from relief or the adrenaline crash, Stefan couldn't tell. "The money is gone." "Let it go," Stefan murmured, holding her tight against the biting cold. It was poison anyway. They rested only long enough to catch their breath. Slowly, they picked themselves up and crossed the remainder of the pass. They descended into the eastern valley, leaving behind the frozen corpse of a corrupt detective and a fortune scattered to the pines. Months later, a letter containing Flint's dropped journal detailing his rogue plot was sent anonymously to William Pinkerton in Chicago, clearing Clara's name forever. She was no longer an heiress. She was a mountain man's wife. Stefan and Clara built a new life, not on stolen railroad gold, but on the unyielding foundation of their survival. Their wild Western romance proves that sometimes the wrong train delivers exactly the right destination. If you were captivated by this incredible true-to-life frontier tale, hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical dramas.